As we speak here today, Russian armed forces to justify its aggression and the war. Tomorrow, the Human Rights Council will hold an urgent debate on human rights situation in Ukraine stemming from the Russian aggression. It will consider the resolution establishing a commission of inquiry on Russia's crime in Ukraine. It will become a crucial investigative mechanism in ensuring accountability for the perpetrators. I call on all countries to support this effort, as well as to participate in the urgent debate preceding the adoption of the resolution. Ladies and gentlemen, in Ukraine, I've been often asked by foreign journalists and friends, it will consider what are the moods in Ukraine. And here I have to be clear. Yes, we are under inhuman attack. We are under very cynical attack of a neighboring country. But this is not the time to cry our tears. We will for sure do so after our victory, and our tears and our eyes will be full of tears of happiness when we hug our beloved ones, when we will start to restore and build up cities that are ruined after the airstrikes, attacks and invasion. I'm standing in front of the Cabinet of Ministers banner. The government is fully operating. And on behalf of the Ukrainian government, I want to conclude my speech saying and quoting our President Volodymyr Zelensky, who said, addressing the international community when he was offered a shelter, when he was suggested to leave the country because of the risk for his life, he said, "We don't need a right. We need your help." Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency and all three.
We're all scared. Why us? Why us regular people?
How worried are you about President Zelensky?
Russia has continued to bomb both residential areas and administrative buildings in the city. A local hospital has also been damaged. We had injured people in the hospital. The basement served as a bomb shelter. People were hiding here from the shelling of the so-called peacemakers. Let's put it like that. Emergency services in the city of Zerhaitemir spent the early hours of Wednesday morning trying to control raging fires. Local authorities say a Russian airstrike hit the city, which is west of the capital Kyiv. In Kyiv itself, people are desperately trying to leave. They continue to flock to the central station as they try to escape the capital. On Tuesday evening, a missile hit the city's TV tower, killing at least 5 people. The tower is close to Babin Yar, a memorial site to one of the biggest single massacres of Jews during the Holocaust.
And they refused to take into account their legitimate...
This is a country under attack, with no one really sure when or...
People have been dying, mainly civilians, the elderly, women and children.
Оперативный параграф 8 внесенной резолюции, проекта резолюции, лицемерно призывает все стороны выполнять Минские соглашения. Очень хочется спросить авторов и соавторов этого проекта, где вы были все, господа? Почему вы за эти 8 лет так и не смогли заставить Киев выполнить положение этих документов? Под бесцеремонным давлением со стороны США, Канады, стран Евросоюза, которые, естественно, считают себя эталоном демократии, оказались и ООН, и ОБСЕ, и Совет Европы, и вообще все международное сообщество, которые так и не нашли в себе сил и мужества отреагировать, адекватно отреагировать на преступные действия украинских властей. Нас спрашивают, зачем вы вообще вспоминаете события прошлого сейчас, когда в ходе вооруженного конфликта гибнут люди? А наш ответ на самом деле очень прост. Мы так и не извлекли надлежащих правильных уроков из событий Второй мировой войны. Международное сообщество так и не осознало, что любые ростки неонацизма в любой стране должны быть немедленно уничтожены. То, что происходит сегодня в этом зале и за его пределами, является очередной яркой демонстрацией, очередным ярким подтверждением двойных стандартов со стороны США и их союзников, жертвами преступлений которых уже стали сотни тысяч людей в Югославии, Ираке, Ливии, Афганистане. Мы категорически отвергаем обвинения в адрес Беларуси в вовлеченности в незаконное использование силы против Беларуси. Я вам открою страшную тайну. Мы действительно вовлечены. Президент Республики Беларусь Александр Лукашенко лично предпринял максимальные усилия для того, чтобы обеспечить контакты между российской и украинской сторонами. Наша вовлеченность сегодня таким образом заключается в организации переговоров между Российской Федерацией и Украиной и в обеспечении всего необходимого для их проведения. И мы искренне желаем успехов участникам переговоров. Многие страны в своих выступлениях ни слова не сказали об этих переговорах. Мы понимаем, что они никогда не произнесут название нашей страны в положительном или хотя бы в нейтральном ключе. Хочется спросить этих людей, вас всех, вы просто не хотите упоминать Беларусь, или вы не желаете успеха этим переговорам? В качестве реакции на события на Украине некоторые страны привычно схватились за свой излюбленный инструмент – санкции. Мы хотим вас предупредить, именно вы будете нести всю ответственность за то, что применение санкций в отношении, например, белорусских калийных удобрений приведет к обострению экономических и социальных проблем и росту голода и в ваших собственных странах, и в странах, которые находятся за тысячи километров от Беларуси. Объявленные санкции уже не являются точечными. Они направлены на удушение экономики и ухудшение уровня жизни людей. Применяемые сегодня санкции, некоторые договорились до того, что объявляется экономическая война. Это худшее проявление экономического и финансового терроризма. Представители некоторых государств рапортуют о полной открытости их границ для выезда из Украины украинцев и иностранцев, граждан третьих стран. На этой якобы открытой границе, сообщаю вам, граждане Беларуси и России, в частности, все мужчины старше 18 лет, сталкиваются с огромными проблемами при попытках выезда из Украины. Украинские власти не выпускают их из страны, и россияне, и белорусы фактически удерживаются в качестве заложников. Известны также случаи проявления расизма и дискриминации, избиения и выкидывания через границу иностранных граждан польскими пограничниками. 26 февраля польские пограничники избили и выдворили обратно на Украину группу из примерно 100 индийских студентов, которые в последующем были благополучно размещены в лагере для беженцев в Румынии. К нам в Минске, в Беларуси, поступают многочисленные обращения как от граждан Беларуси, так и от посольств тех стран, ваших стран, граждане которых хотели бы выехать в Беларусь для возвращения домой. С нашей стороны граница открыта. Мы готовы принимать как белорусов, так и рассматривать обращения о въезде граждан третьих стран. Мы призываем украинскую сторону отозваться на наши призывы и открыть гуманитарные коридоры или хотя бы один гуманитарный коридор для выезда в Беларусь через белорусско-украинскую границу. Мы уже официально обратились с этой просьбой, настоятельной просьбой, в представительство ООН и Международного комитета Красного Креста в Минске. Вызывает серьезное беспокойство разгул издевательств и мародерства, в том числе в отношении иностранцев на Украине. Бесконтрольная раздача оружия уже привела к резкому всплеску насилия и грабежей. Жертвами становятся обычные люди. Например, водители-дальнобойщики, которые осуществляют международные перевозки грузов. Среди них уже есть погибшие. Почему вы все замалчиваете эти факты? Кстати, насколько нам известно, на уровне руководства Африканского Союза были уже сделаны соответствующие заявления. Беларусь потеряла треть населения во Второй мировой войне. Мы хорошо знаем цену человеческой жизни. Мы скорбим по всем погибшим за последние 8 лет в Донецкой и Луганской народных республиках, в Киеве. Мы скорбим по людям, которые были заживо сожжены в Одессе. Мы скорбим по всем, кто погибает сегодня. Только переговоры могут остановить кровопролитие. Беларусь уже сделала многое и продолжает делать все возможное для урегулирования конфликта. В любой войне у каждой стороны есть своя правда. Любая война имеет собственную динамику, и по мере ее продолжения становится все более ожесточенной, что мы сегодня и наблюдаем. Мы все буквально тонем в море, в потоке лжи и дезинформации, которые распространяются информационными террористами. По-другому я этих людей назвать не могу. Абсолютное большинство из которых при этом сидит в удобных креслах, в теплых кабинетах за тысячи километров от зоны боевых действий. Через несколько минут мы все приступим к голосованию по внесенному проекту резолюции. Этот проект на самом деле должен состоять из одного параграфа, написанного не на ООНовском языке, а на нормальном человеческом языке. Он должен содержать призыв к немедленному прекращению военных действий и проведению переговоров. Я понимаю, что у каждого из вас есть инструкции из столиц. Я также знаю, что некоторых из вас очень настойчиво просили проголосовать за этот проект. И я не имею никаких иллюзий по поводу того, какими будут результаты нашего голосования. И все-таки я прошу вас еще раз подумать и проголосовать по совести, хотя я понимаю, что за голосование по совести в ООН можно потерять работу. Благодарю вас за внимание.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, my fellow delegates, to all those who dedicate themselves to the noble mission of this institution. Today, we call on Russia to stop its unprovoked, unjustified, unconscionable war. We call on Russia to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We call on another neighbor of Ukraine, Belarus, who you've just heard from, to stop supporting the war and stop allowing its territory to be used to facilitate this aggression. And today, we stand together in holding Russia accountable for its violations of international law and to address the horrific human rights and humanitarian crisis unfolding before our eyes. This is an extraordinary moment. For the first time in 40 years, the Security Council has convened an emergency special session of the General Assembly. 40 years. Most of the men and women fighting in Ukraine were not even born the last time the United Nations came together in this way to unite for peace. And I would venture that many of the people in this room were not born when that happened. But a few of the eldest Ukrainians and Russians might recall a moment like this, a moment when one aggressive European nation invaded another without provocation to claim the territory of its neighbor. A moment when a European dictator declared he would return his empire to its former glory. An invasion that caused a war so horrific that it spurred this organization into existence. Now, at more than any other point in recent history, the United Nations is being challenged. If the United Nations has any purpose, it is to prevent war. It is to condemn war, to stop war. That is our job here today. It is the job you were sent here to do, not just by your capitals, but by all of humanity. A lot has happened very quickly to bring us to this unique moment. It was barely a week ago when, in the dead of night, President Putin launched a full-scale invasion of our fellow UN member state. At the very moment the Security Council was holding an urgent meeting attempting to foster diplomacy and de-escalation. As the Security Council discussed peace, Putin declared war. Ukraine has defended itself with great courage and vigor. As President Biden said in his State of the Union address last night, President Putin, and I quote, met a wall of strength he never imagined. He met the Ukrainian people. But the brazen and indiscriminate nature of Russia's attack has had devastating, horrific consequences for the entire country. Russia has bombed residential apartment buildings. It has bombed sacred burial grounds. It has shelled kindergartens and orphanages and hospitals. Russia has spurred mass hunger and caused so many to flee their homes. The latest UN estimate are marching toward 1 million people. We thank the countries who have opened their borders, who have opened their hearts, opened their homes to those fleeing Ukraine. And I want to echo the UN Refugee Agency's call to help and welcome all those fleeing conflict without regard to race or nationality. Refugees are refugees. For those who remain, Russia is destroying critical infrastructure, vital services which provide millions of people across Ukraine with drinking water to stay alive, gas to keep people from freezing to death. And now it appears Russia is preparing to increase the brutality of its campaign against Ukraine. We've seen videos of Russian forces moving exceptionally lethal weaponry into Ukraine, which has no place on the battlefield. That includes cluster munitions and vacuum bombs, which are banned under the Geneva Convention. We all have seen the 40-mile-long lethal convoy charging toward Kyiv. President Putin continues to escalate, putting Russia's nuclear forces on high alert, threatening to invade Finland and Sweden. At every step of the war, Russia has betrayed the United Nations. Russia's actions go against everything this body stands for. People across the world have already united together in exactly the way this General Assembly must do today. Protests and vigils against Russia's war and in solidarity with Ukraine, marked with blue and yellow, have sprung up across the globe. These are protests for peace. From Bangkok to Budapest, from Berlin to Buenos Aires, from Sydney to Seoul, from Calgary to Cape Town, and even in Moscow and Minsk. People everywhere are standing up to call for President Putin to stop this attack. The Russian people are themselves asking how many lives Putin will sacrifice for his cynical ambitions. And they are appalled at the answer. To the Russian protesters, I say thank you. Thank you for your bravery. To the Russian soldiers sent to the front lines of an unjust, unnecessary war, I say your leaders are lying to you. Do not commit war crimes. Do everything you can to put down your weapons and leave Ukraine. The truth is that this war was one man's choice and one man alone, President Putin. It was his choice to force hundreds of thousands of people to stuff their lives into backpacks and flee the country, to send newborn babies into makeshift bomb shelters, to make children with cancer huddle in hospital basements, interrupting their treatment, essentially sentencing them to death. Those were President Putin's choices. Now it's time for us to make ours. The United States is choosing to stand with the Ukrainian people. We are choosing, in coordination with our allies and partners, to impose severe consequences on Russia. We are choosing to hold Russia accountable for its actions, and we will soon turn to vote on a resolution that does just that. We believe this is a simple vote. Vote yes if you believe UN member states, including your own, have a right to sovereignty and territorial integrity. Vote yes if you believe Russia should be held to account for its actions. Vote yes if you believe in upholding the UN Charter and everything this institution stands for. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Observer State of the Holy See.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, thank for calling this emergency special session, as in recent days we have been shaken by something tragic, war. The Holy See joins the many member states and millions across the globe who call for the immediate cessation of hostilities in Ukraine and the return to diplomacy and dialogue. Mr. President, the organization is founded to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. It is the duty of all states to seek to resolve disputes through negotiation, mediation, or by other peaceful means, even when war has commenced. Mr. President, last Sunday, Pope Francis expressed his closeness with all who now suffer as a result of the conflict, stressing that, and I quote, "It is urgent to open humanitarian corridors, and those fleeing must be welcomed." With heart broken by what is happening in Ukraine, and let us not forget the wars in other parts of the world, I repeat, put down your weapons. Those who love peace reject war as an instrument of aggression against the freedom of other peoples and as a means for the settlement of international disputes. End of quote. The Holy See wishes to express, also in this forum, its appreciation to those states which are offering humanitarian assistance to those in need, both in Ukraine and in neighboring countries, in which many Ukrainians have sought safety. Mr. President, Pope Francis has called on believers and non-believers alike to observe this Wednesday, 2nd of March, as a day to be close to the suffering of the Ukrainian people, to feel that we are all brothers and sisters, and to implore of God the end of this war. The Holy See is convinced that there is always time for goodwill. There is still room for negotiations. There is still a place for the exercise of a wisdom that can prevent the predominance of partisan interest, safeguard the legitimate aspiration of everyone, and spare the world from the folly and horrors of war. May this emergency special session advance efforts that help attain this end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Holy See. I now give the floor to the observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished representatives. The Sovereign Order of Malta, a sovereign entity which provides global humanitarian aid with a special mission to serving the sick and the poor, has observed with great sadness and regret the ongoing conflict which has impacted the lives of so many citizens of Ukraine and which is currently created an unprecedented flow of refugees seeking peace and security across their nation's borders. In 8 years of conflict, the Order's embassy to Ukraine has provided considerable support, advice, and material help to Ukrainian citizens and to non-Ukrainian residents of the country who are in need. The current crisis is seeing multiple cities and towns attacked and bombed, forcing families to leave their homes and seeking shelter elsewhere. Our representatives and ambassadors in the region report that while refugees have sufficient means to travel and find refuge on their own or enjoy dual citizenship with nearby nations, the majority do not have the resources to provide for themselves without support. UN agencies predict that a potential refugee exodus of over 6 million persons might well be the outcome of this situation. In the meanwhile, many elderly people and those who are sick or disabled in some way are unable to escape the bombing and the stress that accompanies civil unrest. Our concern, obviously, is for them as much as it is for those who have managed to leave. Our staff and volunteers in major population centers within Ukraine continue to provide assistance as much as is feasible, given the ongoing security and safety problems. This past weekend, we held a summit of our regional ambassadors and aid providers under the auspices of our international relief agency, Malteser International. At that time, we were able to review both the growing extent of the refugee crisis as well as the initiatives we are taking to support the growing swell of primarily mothers and children and a small number of senior citizens. As of this morning, it is estimated that almost 700,000 individuals have made the journey across the borders of Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, and Moldavia. And each day that the conflict continues, the flow of anguished families will grow. We have seen some nations go out of their way to welcome these individuals and to help them through the trauma. Our Order of Malta staff along the border with Ukraine totals over 5,000 personnel, with tens of thousands of volunteers doing everything from serving hot food and drink, caring for the victims of injury and accident, providing counseling and emotional support, and assisting in securing of short-term accommodation. Volunteers from locations away from the border, many of them from other countries, representing churches and community groups, have driven their cars and vans to provide transportation to new arrivals to ensure that they are given every opportunity to find a place to stay. We are coordinating our activities with international aid agencies, such as the Red Cross and the UNHCR, and are engaged in an international fundraising program to ensure that adequate resources continue to be available for the support and maintenance of those in need. We are encouraged that the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva will be holding a debate on human rights in Ukraine today. Representatives from our government will be participating in this important discussion. We appeal to nations of goodwill to appreciate the trauma experienced by all refugees. In particular, we appeal to countries who are receiving refugees to extend the same welcome they're offering Ukrainians to those of other national and ethnic groups who have been caught in this conflict and who are seeking security. The offer of help and support must cross ethnic, racial, and cultural lines and not be tainted by discriminatory acts or attitudes. This conflict in Europe drives home the realization that the issues of internally displaced persons and the needs of refugees forced from their homes affects the whole world: Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and now Europe. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta for the statement. I now give the floor to the observer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, International IDEA strongly condemns the unprovoked war of aggression waged by the Russian Federation with the involvement of Belarus against Ukraine, a sovereign nation and a democracy. This is in breach of international law and international agreements and a rules-based international order that underpins the shared objective of global peace and the existence of organizations such as International IDEA. The invasion order by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, is a blatant violation of the UN Charter. As firm believers in the rights of peoples to exercise their fundamental rights and freedoms, we convey our full support to and solidarity with the people of Ukraine. They are innocent victims of this aggression. We salute the brave partners and democracy activists with whom International IDEA has engaged in recent years when Ukraine made huge progress towards being a stable and thriving democracy. We call on the international community to spring into action to protect them and mitigate the humanitarian consequences of the invasion. We cannot fail to note that the military operation was launched while the UN Security Council was meeting to discuss the crisis. We reiterate our firm belief that international crises should be addressed through the means of multilateral diplomacy and resolved on the basis of the principles of the Charter. It is particularly unfortunate that this naked rejection of these principles happens during a pandemic that has rendered evident the need for increased global cooperation to make the world governable and to achieve justice for all. In these days, we are witnessing what an unchecked ruler, for decades trampling fundamental rights and freedoms of his own citizens, can do to undermine peace and democracy beyond his own borders. Ukraine is a country that has successfully reached democratic standards over the past 2 decades, from respecting media freedoms to free and fair elections, local democracy, and the fights against corruption. It is no wonder President Putin is scared of such democratic vibrancy at his doorstep. This is a pivotal moment for Democrats all over the world to stand united in support of Ukraine. It is also the moment to reinforce action to counter and to prevent the rise of authoritarian regimes elsewhere, which cannot survive without kleptocracy and the systematic violation of human rights and freedoms. We call on Russia to immediately withdraw its military forces and fully respect Ukraine's sovereignty. Revanchist interpretations of history and attempts to change borders based on ethno-nationalist fantasies offer not a luminous path for humanity, but a route towards darkness and endless cycles of violence. They certainly don't provide any hope to the younger and unborn generations that will bear the brunt of the climate crisis, or to the billions of vulnerable people around the world that are yet to realize the promise of a life free from fear and want, and the promise of the Agenda 2030. Those are the real challenges of our age. We encourage the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, to make use of his good offices to advance ceasefire talks, humanitarian access to the war-affected areas, and protection of civilians, and particularly the most vulnerable ones. We urge UN member states to adopt and enforce sanctions against the Russian Federation until withdrawal of their forces from Ukraine and the full restoration of its territorial integrity. We urge UN member states to do whatever it takes in compliance with the principles of the UN Charter to stop this war and prevent any further escalation of conflict. International IDEA will do its part in collaboration with the United Nations, our member states, and other democratic governments and organizations to protect in Ukraine and elsewhere the principle that every country has a right to freely determine its own fate on the basis of the will of the people, freely expressed. Democracy's institutions and processes are the best means to protect their right. Today, we must stand up for these principles. Today, we must stand up for Ukraine, which embodies these principles and defends them to our greatest respect. Diakuyu, thank you.
I thank the distinguished observer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. The General Assembly has thus concluded this stage of the consideration of Agenda Item 5. The Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council S/2014/136, to take action on a draft resolution issued as document A/ES-11/L1. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine to introduce draft resolution A/ES-11/L1.
Mr. President, Secretary General, distinguished delegates. We are living through a defining moment for our generation. Our generation is the generation that was supposed by our predecessors to be saved from scourge of war. That is why our predecessors created the United Nations. And yet today, it falls to us to save future generations. Let me read the following text. Our position is that whatever grievances a nation may have. However objectionable it finds the status quo, aggressive warfare is an illegal means for settling those grievances or for altering those conditions. It may be that the nation faced desperate problems that would have warranted the boldest measures short of war. All other methods, persuasion, propaganda, economic competition, diplomacy, were open to an aggrieved country. But aggressive warfare was outlawed. The defendants did make aggressive war a war in violation of treaties. They did attack and invade their neighbors in order to effectuate a foreign policy which they knew could not be accomplished by measures short of war. And that is as far as we accuse or propose to inquire. End of quote. Said in his opening statement to the International Military Tribunal on November 21, 1945, in the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg, Justice Robert Jackson, Chief of Counsel. And these words are addressed today to Mr. Putin, Mr. Shoigu, Mr. Lavrov, Mr. Volodin, Ms. Matvienko, and perhaps dozens more, but certainly they are not addressed to the Russian citizens, those Russian citizens who try to preserve their dignity. For almost a week, Ukraine is fighting under the bombs and missiles, fighting in the face of armadas of hardware and countless crowds of enemies. They have come to the Ukrainian soil not only to kill some of us, not only to shift our course and priorities. They have come to deprive Ukraine of the very right to exist. They have come to resolve use of indiscriminate weapons such as multiple rocket launchers and aerial bombs against the residential areas. Ukrainians are being killed by Russian ballistic missiles and thermobaric weapons. Just yesterday, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Zhytomyr, Mariupol, Melitopol, and many other cities and towns sustained heavy shellings that killed dozens of innocents, including children. Ukraine deeply regrets that a student from India has become a victim of this shelling by the Russian armed forces in Kharkiv. We offer our deepest sympathies to India and the relatives of the victim. A Chinese citizen was also injured in another Ukrainian city because of Russia's deadly attacks. The Ukrainian and foreign citizens have become hostages of the Russian armed aggression against Ukraine. In Kyiv, Russian murderers hit the city TV tower, killing 5 passerbys. One of the missiles dropped on the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial, a sacred place of commemoration of Jews, Ukrainians, Roma, and representatives of other ethnic groups killed by Nazis during the World War II. What an irony when victims of Nazis are being killed for the second time by Nazi modern followers. As the President of Ukraine asked, what was the point of repeating the slogan, "Never again," in 80 years? It's already clear that the goal of Russia is not an occupation only. It is genocide. On 7th and 8th of March 2022, the International Court of Justice will hold public hearings in the case concerning allegations of genocide under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Ukraine versus Russian Federation. Also, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has decided to proceed with opening of a formal investigation into the situation in Ukraine. Unprovoked escalation of Russian aggression against Ukraine gives reasons to believe that crimes within the jurisdiction of the ICC continue to be committed on the territory of Ukraine. Along with the situation in Crimea and Donbass, recent events suggest that aggressors' troops continue to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. Dear colleagues, one might consider, observing the bloodshed in Ukraine, that it is not my war. It is a mistake. The evil will never stop. It requires more and more space to conquer. If tolerated, it advances further and further. The draft resolution is one of the building blocks to build a wall to stop it, to stop in Ukraine and not to let it go further. The wall that will protect all of you, in particular younger generations. Distinguished delegates, by voting today, you also reconfirm your country's commitment to the UN Charter. After the vote, I invite you, ambassadors and representatives, to stop by the Indonesian lounge and to sign this little blue book. Little but of global magnitude. Every vote in favor of the resolution and every signature of country that voted in favor would be a historical reconfirmation of the Charter. It is very easy, ladies and gentlemen, to sign the Charter at time of peace. It is the duty to sign and reconfirm and implement the Charter at the time of war. So stop by the Indonesian lounge, put the name of your country if you voted in favor, And after you sign this book, I will hand it over to the Secretary General for keeping the book in his office, in front of him. So at every single moment, the Secretary General will get an inspiration from the overwhelming majority of nations who still trust in the UN, who still trust in the UN Charter. There is a very fragile gentleman, a very old one. He was born in a territory that was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. He will celebrate his 102 years birthday in 9 days. His name is Benjamin Ferenc. Benjamin Ferenc was an investigator of war crimes, a chief prosecutor at one of the 12 subsequent trials of Nuremberg. Later, he became an advocate of international rule of law and for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. With the permission of the producer, I would play a couple of seconds of his words. And I want you to listen very carefully.
It's hard to do. It's 3 words: law, not war. If you can do that, you save every day billions of dollars, which you can use to deal with the legitimate complaints of old people who need medical care, students who have to pay for their tuition, all the legitimate complaints which could be solved if we didn't spend the money on weapons to kill them instead of helping them. And that is the current system. Now, how are you going to do it? I will end by telling you how to do it and the principles which have guided me. There are 3 principles. 1, never give up. 2, never give up. 3, I hear you, never give up. Good luck. I wish you the best of luck.
Please show respect. Show respect to the Charter. Show respect to the Secretary General. Show respect to this gentleman who will celebrate 102 years since his birthday. I call upon all responsible member states to support the draft. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Before I open the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
President,
господин генеральный секретарь,
Secretary
уважаемые
General,
коллеги,
colleagues,
Россия
Russia
просит
would
поставить
ask for
проект резолюции
this
на
draft
голосование.
resolution to be put to the vote.
Призываем
And we
вас
call
не
on you
поддерживать этот
not to
проект.
support this draft.
Однако мы знаем
However, we
о
know
беспрецедентном
about the
давлении, которое
unprecedented pressure
наши западные партнеры оказывали на огромное количество стран, заставляя их проголосовать так, как это угодно им. Это нельзя назвать даже давлением. Это были открытые циничные угрозы. Нам об этом известно. Этот документ не будет способствовать прекращению военных действий. Наоборот, он может ободрить киевских радикалов и националистов и дальше любой ценой определять политику в стране, удерживая в заложниках мирное население. Причем не в переносном, а в прямом смысле этого слова. Сейчас именно так и происходит в ряде крупных городов Украины, где население используется в качестве живого щита. Сегодня стало известно, что вооруженные силы Украины не дают мирным жителям Мариуполя покинуть город, удерживают их, в том числе женщин и детей, в одной из школ Мариуполя. Насильно доставляют обратно всех гражданских лиц, которые пытались покинуть город по предоставленным гуманитарным коридорам. Нам также известно и о планируемых националистическими батальонами провокациях, которые они заготовили с участием гражданского населения, с тем, чтобы впоследствии обвинить в этом российские войска. Вопреки нормам международного гуманитарного права, в жилых кварталах размещается военная техника, системы залпового огня, артиллерийские установки. Мы сегодня передадим примеры подобных действий руководству ООН, которое до настоящего момента утверждало, что не располагает подобными свидетельствами. Хотя видеоролики, снятые простыми украинскими гражданами, свободно распространяются в интернете. Ответственность за это полностью лежит на украинских властях, так же, как и за безответственную и преступную раздачу оружия всем желающим, включая выпущенных из тюрем заключенных. Это уже привело к массовым случаям грабежей, убийств и мародерства. Уважаемые коллеги, ваш отказ поддержать проект сегодня стал бы голосованием в пользу мирной Украины, свободной от радикализма и неонацизма, живущей в мире со своими соседями и отказавшейся от внешнего управления. Именно на достижение этих целей направлена наша специальная военная операция, которую авторы резолюции пытаются представить в качестве агрессии. Мы сегодня слышали от украинского представителя слова о нацизме, но он стыдливо умолчал о разгуле неонацизма на самой Украине, о бесчинствах неонацистских и националистических радикальных организаций, о факельных шествиях и прославлении пособников Гитлера. Те, кто интересовался развитием украинского кризиса, прекрасно понимают его генезис. Действуя сегодня, мы прежде всего стремимся остановить восьмилетнюю войну майданного режима с населением Донбасса. За прошедшие годы наша страна сделала все возможное и невозможное, чтобы избежать такого сценария. Мы, по выражению генерального секретаря, кстати говоря, перевернули все камни и постучались в каждую дверь, однако так и не были услышаны. Жители Донбасса продолжали и продолжают бомбить, не собираясь останавливаться на 14 тысячах погибших, подавляющее большинство из которых приходится на жителей ДНР и ЛНР. Цели нашей специальной операции, объявленные на основании статьи 51 Устава ООН, выполняются и будут достигнуты. При этом мы не наносим ударов по гражданским объектам и мирным жителям. Не верьте огромному количеству фейков, распространяемых в интернете на этот счет. Эти фейки пеклись, как пирожки, в Центре информационно-психологических операций специальных сил операции Украины. Этот центр вчера был уничтожен. Мирный сценарий для Украины можно ускорить, если радикалы позаботятся о сохранности жизни граждан своей страны и не будут прикрываться им. Такого призыва в тексте поставленного на голосование документа нет. В нем также ничего не сказано о незаконном перевороте в Киеве, когда в феврале 2014 года при попустительстве Германии, Франции и Польши и при поддержке Соединенных Штатов был свергнут законно избранный президент страны. В этом проекте нет ничего и о том, что новые националистические власти тотчас же ограничили права граждан на использование русского языка. Это дало старт огромной цепочке нарушений базовых прав жителей Востока страны, и не только Востока, включая самое ценное право на жизнь. Многие из вас не хотят ничего слышать о трагедии, которая началась на Украине после Майданного переворота 2014 года, о заживо сожженных людях в Одессе, о преследованиях и убийствах несогласных. И самым ярким проявлением этого стала развязанная Киевом война против Донбасса. Ничего в документе нет и о том, что на протяжении 8 лет Соединенные Штаты и Европа накачивали и сейчас накачивают Украину вооружением, помогая майданному режиму убивать мирных жителей на Донбассе. Оправдывали лояльные киевские власти за полное игнорирование минских договоренностей и саботаж резолюции Совета Безопасности 2202. Наконец, этот проект — это очевидная попытка тех, кто за последние десятилетия совершил бесчисленное количество агрессий, незаконных с точки зрения международного права военных операций, переворотов, одним из которых стал и майданный переворот на Украине, выставить себя поборниками международной законности. Благодарю вас.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Serbia.
Most sincerely regrets events taking place in the east of Europe. Russia and Ukraine have always been friendly country to the Republic of Serbia, and Serbian people perceives Russians and Ukrainians as fraternal nations. We felt loss of life of each man in Ukraine is true tragedy. The Republic of Serbia is committed to observing principles of territorial integrity and political independence of states as one of the basic principles of international law based on UN Charter and final Act from Helsinki from 1975, which guarantees the right of states to inviolability of borders, just like it is committed to preservation of sovereignty and integrity of its own territory. The Republic of Serbia, likewise, advocating respect for territorial integrity of other sovereign nations, and regardless of not agreeing with all formulation state in resolution, will vote in favor of a resolution. I am obliged to point to PP 13 and remind that the first attack against a sovereign state on the soil of Europe after the Second World War took place not so long ago, in 1999, when 19 countries attacked, at that time, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, primarily Republic of Serbia, when there was no appropriate reaction of such distinguished institution to this flagrant violation of UN Charter, despite the fact they still suffer from consequence of severe violation of fundamental principles of international law by others. Serbia is not giving up these principles even today. The Republic of Serbia will continue to advocate termination of conflicts, expecting that the parties will invest additional efforts into reaching diplomatic solution and creating conditions for peace throughout dialogue. Serbia will provide all kinds of humanitarian aid to endangered Ukrainian citizens while remaining committed to peace and consistent respect for international law. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Serbia. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the draft resolution before us today clearly represents a prejudiced attitude based on political propaganda. It's a means of political pressure.
معدو مشروع القرار على
Those who prepared the draft resolution incorporated an aggressive language against the Russian Federation to belittle its legitimate stand based on its security concerns and its right to protect its people from the threats to national Russian security. Belarus is also impacted by this draft resolution. This draft resolution represents a flagrant political hypocrisy. Had the US and its Western allies been serious in de-escalating the situation, they would have fulfilled the promises they undertook 3 decades ago not to expand EU and transform Ukraine into a continuous threat to the Russian Federation. And they should have pressured Ukraine to abide by Minsk and to stop the violations against the civilians in Donbass, let alone those countries' eagerness to supply Ukraine with heavy weaponry and missiles, encouraging volunteers to fight in Ukraine. This indicates the clear-cut desire of those countries for provocations and not for containment and de-escalation. This draft resolution coincides with huge media campaign to spread erroneous information and lies. It's not designed to find a clear-cut and real solution for the crisis, rather to defame the Russian Federation. It is a text that is full of loopholes and untruths. It ignores the real reasons for the escalation of tension and for the eruption of hostilities. Those who are eager to defend the Charter of the United Nations now today, they should have shown the same eagerness vis-à-vis Israel's continued occupation of the Arab territories and the aggression committed by the Turkish forces against our territory. What about the U.S. violations of the territorial integrity of our land, Syrian territories? Syria's rejection of Western hegemonistic policies and interference in the internal affairs of states, prolongating crises, promulgating and spreading anarchy, opting for double standards and selectivities, imposing unilateral sanctions, make it necessary for us to reject this draft resolution and vote against it. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Mr. President, it is clear from the debate over the past 2 days that the membership of the United Nations is united in its call to end the war in Ukraine and return to diplomacy. St. Vincent and the Grenadines wishes to offer an explanation of its vote on the draft resolution before us today. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines will vote in favor of the draft resolution. We will vote in accordance with our steadfast commitment to upholding the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, which form the core of multilateralism and gave birth to our United Nations 76 years ago. It bears repeating, Mr. President, that these principles underscore respect for sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of states and enjoin member states to refrain from the threat or the use of force in the conduct of their international relations. Our support for the draft resolution is rooted in our conviction that the strict adherence to international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law, and the principles of peace, dialogue, and compromise for the preservation of humanity is not optional. As a small island developing state, full compliance with the bedrock principles of international law remains an existential issue. We take the floor again, Mr. President, to repeat our call for these principles to be applied consistently and upheld as universal truths, instead of selective, uneven, and unpredictable tools to further great power ambition anywhere and by anyone. Historically, and in recent times, we have witnessed the naked hypocrisy, double standards, and cynical misapplication of international law, which we have condemned. Today, we strongly emphasize that our august assembly should apply the fundamental principles of our charter impartially, irrespective of the size, economic, and military power of the principles involved. Mr. President, in the midst of prevailing global challenges, such as the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, we simply cannot afford another conflict. War does not manage grievances. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, therefore, calls for an immediate ceasefire to avert further bloodshed, human suffering, and a global catastrophe, and to engage in peaceful dialogue to find a solution to this war post-haste. Today, we must unite for peace. Thank you, and peace profound to all.
I thank the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of vote before the vote. Before proceeding to take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolution. In light of Article 18, paragraph 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 by a two-thirds majority of the members present and voting? I see no objection. The two-thirds majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of draft resolution A/ES-11/L1. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become the co-sponsors of A/ES-11/L11, Barbados and Cambodia. If any other country
wish to co-sponsor A/ES11/L1, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. There is nothing further, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES-11/L1, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. The result of The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 141, against 5, abstentions 35. Draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
لقد صوتت تونس لصالح القرار اليوم انتصارا لمقاصد ومبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة التي انبنت عليها سياستنا الخارجية وتأكيدا لحرص بلادنا على إنهاء الأزمة باستعمال الوسائل السلمية لفض النزاعات التي تبقى السبيل الوحيد والأمثل لوضع حد للتصعيد والحيلولة دون مزيد تدهور الأوضاع وتفاقم الأزمات والإنسانية.
Of the situation and further human tragedy. The world witnessed so many grueling wars destructive to peace and security and the life of people. Our experience indicates that military options cannot solve any crisis. Dialogue and negotiations can settle all differences and finding compromises. The current crisis in Ukraine comes at a time the world was getting out of COVID-19 and prepare itself for a new stage based on solidarity, cooperation, and effective engagement in multilateral action and achieving our common agenda. We believe that the world cannot undertake or cannot burden itself by further crises. We encouraged the engagement of the parties in peaceful negotiations, and we urge the international community to intensify efforts to obligate these parties to resort to negotiations in a manner to cease hostilities and to prepare the way for finding permanent solution. Given the fact that international peace and security are a whole, Tunisia calls for dealing with all just questions in one standard so that peoples can regain their legitimate rights in accordance with international legitimacy to build a more stable, more peaceful world. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Rwanda.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Mr. President, Rwanda takes the floor to explain its position on the vote we just cast. Rwanda voted in favor of this resolution to firmly support that sovereignty, independence, and interior integrity of any country must be respected. We supported this resolution to reaffirm our commitment to the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, military escalation should cease immediately and go for peaceful settlement of the crisis. The Russian Federation and Ukraine have the key to resolve this conflict. The external intervention will only worsen the situation. Mr. President, we fully support international efforts to de-escalate the war, including the efforts of the Secretary General in solving the crisis. We urge all concerned parties to demonstrate calm and seek a solution to the conflict through dialogue to ensure that civilians do not continue to pay the heaviest price. A lasting solution, Mr. President, will only be achieved through dialogue by both parties, taking into account the concerns of both sides. The current war does not guarantee that it will bring peace. Instead, it's likely to generate subsequent crises and human suffering. Rwanda also expresses serious concern with the extent of humanitarian devastation and peace and security challenges caused by the conflict. We are also concerned by the reports that Africans are being brutally segregated and denied safe exit and admission to neighboring countries. We call on all those who are involved to allow unhindered evacuation without looking at the color of origin of anyone. Mr. President, the founding principles of the United Nations Charter is to live peacefully with each other, uphold the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states while considering the security interests of other countries. Diplomatic options present the better solution to the sustainable peace. We call for open dialogue and negotiations in good faith. Finally, Mr. President, Rwanda calls for a sincere commitment to the United Nations Charter and international order. The ongoing crisis poses a severe threat to international peace and security. We encourage concerned parties to give a chance to peace. We wish to underline that a long-lasting solution to the current crisis primarily lands and is in the hands of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Dialogue is the only option to resolve the current crisis. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Rwanda, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, there continues to be dramatic changes of the situation in Ukraine. What is now unfolding is indeed heart-wrenching. China's basic position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and unequivocal. We always believe that all countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity should be respected, and that international disputes should be resolved peacefully in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. The top priority right now is is to ease the situation on the ground as much as possible and prevent the situation from escalating or even getting out of control. Russia and Ukraine have already held their first round of negotiations. Despite their differences, both sides have shown their willingness to continue the negotiations. China welcomes this. Faced with the highly complex and sensitive situation, China once again calls on the international community to stick to the overall direction of a political settlement and foster an enabling atmosphere and conditions for direct dialogue and negotiations between the parties concerned. Mr. President, any action taken by the United Nations and the relevant parties should give priority to regional peace and stability and the universal security of all parties, and should play a positive role for de-escalation and diplomatic solutions. Regrettably, the draft resolution submitted to this emergency special session for vote has not undergone full consultations with the whole membership, nor does it take into full consideration the history and the complexity of the current crisis. It does not highlight the importance of the principle of indivisible security or the urgency of promoting political settlement and stepping up diplomatic efforts. These are not in line with China's consistent position. Therefore, we had no choice but to abstain in the voting. Mr. President, the final settlement of the Ukraine crisis requires abandoning the Cold War mentality, abandoning the logic of ensuring one's own security at the expense of others' security, and abandoning the approach of seeking regional security by expanding military blocs. It is important to give full attention and respect to the legitimate security concerns of all countries, and on that basis, conduct negotiations to put in place a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security mechanism. Blindly exerting pressure and imposing sanctions and creating division and confrontation will only further complicate the situation, result in a rapid spillover of the negative impact of the crisis, and affect even more countries. We call on the international community to take a responsible approach, promote the relevant parties to immediately return to the track of political settlement, and seek a comprehensive solution to the Ukraine issue through dialogue and consultation. China is ready to continue its constructive role in this regard. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, Secretary General, Excellencies, the delegation of Sierra Leone has requested for the floor to explain its position on the agenda item and vote on the resolution. The government of Sierra Leone is gravely concerned about the regrettable, serious situation created in Ukraine with ramifications for regional and international peace and security. Sierra Leone also expresses serious concern over the growing refugee and humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine, and particularly the safety and well-being of Sierra Leonean students in Ukraine. In appreciating efforts to provide the necessary safety and refuge, it is important for all those fleeing the conflict to be treated equally and with dignity, without discrimination, whether on the basis of race or status. A blanket denial is not the answer, nor representative of the values we seek to protect. Mr. President, Sierra Leone voted in favor of the resolution based on our fundamental belief in the sanctity of the United Nations Charter, its principles, and the purposes of the organization. Our vote today is not a selective application of our fundamental belief in the principles of sovereign equality of all UN member states, the territorial integrity or political independence of member states, non-interference, and the peaceful settlement of dispute. Our vote today is not to absolve the actions and inactions of the United Nations, particularly in addressing peace and security questions in Africa. While we believe that the United Nations must be consistent in the application of its charter and in pursuit of its purposes, resorting to the threat or use of force and the violation of the territorial integrity of any member state inconsistent with the charter must be rejected. Sierra Leone accordingly calls for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We also call for the immediate cessation of hostilities, and in this regard, we welcome the commencement of ceasefire talks, and we urge for the continuation of the talks in a meaningful way. Finally, we also urge for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand has carefully considered the draft and voted in support of the resolution because of the overriding importance that Thailand attaches to the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter and those of international law, in particular, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the non-use of force against states. Our support of the resolution also underlines our deep concerns for the plight of affected civilians and the humanitarian consequences of the hostilities and violence in the area. In this regard, we call on all parties to fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. We are also concerned with the potential longer-term consequences on the rules-based international order and renew our call towards peace and for all parties to enhance dialogue through various means to truly realize a peaceful settlement of the situation. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Mr. President, we recognize the exceptional circumstances we are all facing, and we share the conviction that the General Assembly could not remain silent. The resolution adopted this morning conveys a message, and Brazil has added its voice to that of other members. The adoption of this resolution by the General Assembly shows the unwavering commitment of the international community to upholding the core principles upon which the UN is built. We are appreciative of the attention given in different paragraphs of the text to the critical need to monitor and alleviate the humanitarian situation on the ground. We also welcome the text for urging the parties to the conflict to fully respect international humanitarian law, to guarantee the safety of civilians, as well as of humanitarian and medical personnel, and to facilitate unhindered access of humanitarian assistance to those in need. The resolution as adopted, however, does not go far enough in underscoring that the cessation of hostilities is only a first step to achieve peace. Sustainable peace needs additional steps. In this respect, it is regrettable that the supportive role of the United Nations, that the United Nations can and should play has been left by the wayside in the eagerness to point fingers. Yes, the resolution is a call for peace by the international community, but peace requires more than the silence of guns and the withdrawal of troops. The path to peace requires comprehensive work on the security concerns of the parties. The only precondition should be an immediate ceasefire. And Mr. President, the resolution cannot be seen as permissive towards the indiscriminate application of sanctions and the deployment of arms. These initiatives are not conducive to the proper resumption of a constructive diplomatic dialogue and risk further escalating tensions with unpredictable consequences to the region and beyond. We also have concerns about preambular paragraph 15. It is not constructive at this moment fraught with danger in this particular resolution to comment on military measures adopted by any specific nuclear power, be it the Russian Federation or the members of NATO. Once effective negotiations do get started, all the parties must show true flexibility and spirit of compromise. Lasting solutions can only be achieved at the negotiating table through committed dialogue. Brazil continues to urge all actors to de-escalate and to renew efforts in favor of a negotiated diplomatic agreement between Ukraine and Russia that contributes to the establishment of the security and the stability of the region. We stand ready to resolutely work in favor of peace in the discussions in this Assembly, in the Security Council, and in other fora. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. This emergency special session comes as the conflict in Ukraine has reached a dangerous inflection point. The international community is alarmed by developments on the ground, and this is the clear message of today's resounding vote. The humanitarian situation is worsening by the day. We have seen reports of rapidly growing civilian casualties and massive displacement, the extent of which Europe has not experienced in decades. The UAE is deeply concerned by these developments. Our collective responsibility must, however, be towards exhausting all efforts and using all diplomatic channels to prevent a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation. We remain firm in that belief more than ever before. Yesterday, the UAE pledged $5 million in response to the UN's humanitarian flash appeal. We know that in the days, weeks, and months ahead, more must be done. The credibility of this organization, born out of the ashes of World War II, rests on its universal representation and its effectiveness in applying the principles that we all uphold. However, as this conflict has revealed, the clear and full voice of the United Nations has only grown harder to summon because it is not equally applied. Despite deepening divisions, now is time to take a step back, identify diplomatic off-ramps, and engage constructively to end this conflict. It is also a time to summon our reserves of wisdom and experience to guide the way forward. Global solidarity means doing more than focusing on conflicts in some parts of the world while ignoring others. We need to shift our mindset from conflict management to conflict resolution. Our collective security depends on it. Let this crisis be the wake-up call. The future of this organization may rest on that. We all need to galvanize UN efforts to promote the dialogue, work towards an end to the hostilities, and address the humanitarian situation for those most desperately in need. The UAE recognizes the need to meet this moment with renewed diplomacy and leadership, and put the needs of the people on the ground at the center of our efforts. The avenues for dialogue must, however, remain open more urgently than ever before, and we must pursue them together. Mr. President, right now we recognize that this resolution adopted here today is a necessary signal of where we need to be going. Resigning ourselves to a cycle of perpetual violence and sanctions that only adds to the suffering of civilians diminishes us all. We voted for this resolution, and we join with member states in making this appeal to peace, a just peace that endures by recognizing the legitimate concerns of all parties and also abides by the UN's charters of principles and independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity. This resolution, however, as others have said, is not enough for a sustainable peace. Resolution of this conflict requires dialogue and effective diplomacy. This text represents the determination of member states to respond to the conflict today in Ukraine. That is the call that rings clearly from this meeting. We must now turn to finding ways to bring about its peaceful resolution with full respect for and commitment to real and engaged diplomacy. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. India has been deeply concerned over the rapidly deteriorating situation in Ukraine and the ensuing humanitarian crisis. An Indian national was tragically killed in Kharkiv yesterday due to the ongoing hostilities. We express our deepest condolences to his family and to that of each and every innocent civilian who has lost his or her life in this conflict. We demand safe and uninterrupted passage for all Indian nationals, including our students who are still stranded in Ukraine, particularly from Kharkiv and other cities in the conflict zones. Many member states share this concern. We have reiterated this demand to both the Russian Federation and Ukraine. This remains our foremost priority. Ensuring the well-being and safety of our citizens is the basic duty of every government. We have therefore instituted special flights to bring back Indians home from conflict zones. My government has deployed senior ministers as special envoys to countries neighboring Ukraine to facilitate evacuation. We thank all neighboring countries of Ukraine for opening their borders and extending all facilities to our embassies at this time. India has already dispatched humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. This includes medicines, medical equipment, and other relief material. We are sending more such tranches in the coming days. India supports the international community's call for an immediate ceasefire. We also support safe humanitarian access to conflict zones. We remain firm in our conviction that differences can only be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi has unequivocally conveyed this in his discussions with world leaders, including of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. He underscored the urgent imperative for humanitarian access and movement of stranded civilians. We therefore sincerely hope that the second round of talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine will lead to a positive outcome. India urges that all member states demonstrate their commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, to international law, and respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. Keeping in view the totality of the evolving situation, India decided to abstain. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. لقد صوتت بلادي
Thank you, President.
لصالح القرار المتضمن في الوثيقة
We voted in favor
A/ES-11/L1 انطلاقا من إيمانها الثابت بمبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة والقانون الدولي لا سيما مبادئ حسن الجوار وحل النزاعات بالطرق السلمية واحترام السيادة
peaceful resolution of
والاستقلال
conflicts.
والسلامة الإقليمية لجميع
Of
الدول.
respect for the independence
وتؤكد
and territorial
مملكة
integrity of
البحرين
all countries.
على
The
دعمها
Kingdom
لكافة
of
الجهود
Bahrain
الرامية إلى
underscores its
وقف العمليات
support
العسكرية
for all efforts that
واللجوء
seek
إلى
to
الحوار
end hostilities
والوسائل الدبلوماسية.
and for
وشكرا
dialogue
سيد
to
الرئيس.
resume and use all diplomatic means necessary to achieve peace. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bahrain, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eritrea is taking the floor in explanation of vote after the vote on the draft resolution A/ES-11/L1. Eritrea firmly believes that respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, as enshrined in the United Nations Charter, are sacrosanct principles and should be respected by everyone at all times for the attainment of sustainable world peace. Eritrea's vote is demonstration of its uncompromising stand for peace. Its position is against internationalizing, incessant rhetoric, and imposition of unilateral sanctions, which regrettably further polarize international relations and escalate the situation with enormous implications for civilians. Instead, we have consistently opted for world regions to be given the needed space and solidarity to address political problems. The situation between Russia and Ukraine raises serious concern with political, economic, and security ramifications for Europe and the rest of the world. It requires immediate resolution by giving more chance to diplomacy. We hope that the ongoing talks between the two parties on the Belarusian border yields a quick and acceptable agreement to stop the war and pave a foundation for peace in the region. Eritrea opposes all forms of unilateral sanctions as illegal and counterproductive. Eritrea, the country that has been subjected to such measures by the West for 2 decades, including new sets of unilateral measures, understands that sanctions do not resolve problems of peace and security. On the contrary, they only hurt innocent people and undermine the road to peace. It will be remiss if I don't address disturbing reports that African citizens living in Ukraine are facing difficulties to cross the borders. We call on all countries to facilitate safe passage to people fleeing for safety regardless of their racial identity. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by reiterating that, that Eritrea would like to see that the windows for diplomacy remain open. We are confident of the ability of the parties to resolve their differences and reach an outcome that meets the interests and concern of all. We hope that the international community constructively supports the parties in their search for sustainable peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Eritrea, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran is following the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine with grave concern. We reiterate our principled position regarding the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and underline the need for full respect by all parties for the well-established provisions of the United Nations Charter, international law, including international humanitarian law. We emphasize that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must be fully respected, and the safety and security of all civilians must be guaranteed. In order to find long-term and sustainable solutions to such crises, it is necessary to address their root causes. We note that the current complexities in the fragile region of Eastern Europe have been exacerbated by the provocative actions and decisions of the US and NATO. The security concerns of Russia must be respected. Wars and destructions inflicted on civilian lives and infrastructures are not acceptable, wherever they occur. The Islamic Republic of Iran calls for urgent cessation of hostilities and the escalation of tensions in the current conflict. In this regard, Iran underlines the essentiality of dialogue to address issues of concerns to all sides leading to long-term results. The UN must always avoid double standards, particularly when it's considering issues related to the maintenance of international peace and security. It is unfortunate to note that the UN, in particular the Security Council, has at times neglected this principle, which has undermined its credibility. A case in point is the Security Council's handling of the conflict in Yemen. Mr. President, we believe that the text of the resolution before the General Assembly lacks impartiality and realistic mechanisms for resolving the crisis through peaceful means. Furthermore, not all member states of the UN were given the opportunity to engage in negotiations on the text of the resolution. It should be emphasized that the General Assembly is not in a position to determine the existence of an act of aggression because, in addition to Article 39 of the Charter, GA Resolution 3314 of 14 December 1974 calls on the Security Council to determine the existence of an act of aggression. Moreover, convening the emergency special session based on the General Assembly Resolution 377A shall not be considered as the end of the dialogue. My government continues to call for a comprehensive, peaceful, and sustained resolution to the current conflict, including an immediate ceasefire and a start of the dialogue, as well as provision of humanitarian assistance to the people in need. For the above-mentioned reasons, my delegation abstained from voting on the resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. تود مصر أن تؤكد على النقاط التالية اتصالا بالقرار الذي تم اعتماده للتو وصوتت مصر لصالحه انطلاقا من إيمانها الراسخ بقواعد القانون الدولي ومبادئ ومقاصد ميثاق الأمم المتحدة. واحد، إن البحث عن حل سياسي سريع لإنهاء الأزمة عبر الحوار وبالطرق السلمية ومن خلال دبلوماسية نشطة يجب أن يظل نصب أعيننا جميعا والهدف الأساسي للمجتمع الدولي بأسره في التعامل مع الأزمة الراهنة، ومن ثم يتعين إتاحة الحيز السياسي الكفيل بتحقيق ذلك الهدف الأساسي. اثنين، تؤكد مصر أنه لا ينبغي أن يتم غض الطرف عن بحث جذور ومسببات الأزمة الراهنة والتعامل معها بما يضمن نزع فتيل الأزمة وتحقيق الأمن والاستقرار. ثلاثة، ترفض مصر منهج توظيف العقوبات الاقتصادية خارج إطار آليات النظام الدولي متعدد الأطراف من منطلق التجارب السابقة والتي كان لها آثارها الإنسانية السلبية البالغة وما أفضت إليه من تفاقم معاناة المدنيين طوال العقود الماضية. من الواجب أن تتحلى كل الأطراف بالمسؤولية الواجبة لضمان تدفق المساعدات الإنسانية لكل محتاج دون أي تمييز، مع كفالة مرور المقيمين الأجانب بسيابية عبر الحدود، حيث وردت بعض التقارير عن معاملات تمييزية. 5. تجدد مصر التحذير من مغبة الآثار الاقتصادية والاجتماعية للأزمة الراهنة على الاقتصاد العالمي برمته، والذي ما زال يعاني من تداعيات الجائحة، ولعل الاضطراب المتزايد في سلاسل الإمداد وحركة الطيران الدولي لأبلغ دليل على ذلك. إن فاعلية ومصداقية قدرة آليات العمل الدولي متعدد الأطراف في مواجهة التحديات والأزمات المتلاحقة إنما يعتمد على تناول كافة الأزمات الدولية وفقا لمعايير واحدة وثابتة متسقة مع مبادئ الميثاق ومقاصده دون أن تمر عقود يتم خلالها تكريس الأمر الواقع والمعاناة الإنسانية.
Sufferings for decades, and thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to deliver the explanation of vote of my country, Algeria. في الوقت الذي يتابع فيه بلاد الجزائر
at a time when my
وبقلق
country
بالغ
Algeria is closely
تطور الأوضاع
following the
الخطيرة الراهنة والمتصاعدة في
of the
أوكرانيا
situation and the escalation in
يود
Ukraine.
وفد بلادي التأكيد
My
مجددا
delegation would like to
تمسك
emphasize once
الجزائر
again that
الثابت
Algeria
بمبادئ
is
ومقاصد
committed
ميثاق
to
الأمم
the
المتحدة
principles and the
التي
objectives of the
يتعين أن
United
تبقى
Nations,
أساس القانون
which should
الدولي
remain the basis
وحجر
of
الزاوية في
international
العلاقات
law and a
الدولية
cornerstone in
لا سيما
international
تلك
relations,
المتعلقة
especially
باحترام استقلال
the
الدول
respect of
وسيادتها
the
وسلامة
independence,
أراضيها
sovereignty,
طبقا
and
للشرعية
territorial
الدولية
integrity of the member
وحق
states
الشعوب
according
في
to the
تقرير
international
مصيرها
legitimacy and the right of people to
وانطلاقا من
self-determination.
مواقفها المبدئية
And in line
فيما
with
يتعلق
our
بتعزيز النظام متعدد الأطراف
calling for
والحفاظ عليه
enhancing multilateralism and
وتماشيا مع
safeguarding it,
التزامها
and
بتطوير
also in
العلاقات
line with our
الودية بين
commitment
الدول
to developing
على أساس التعايش
amicable
السلمي
relationships
والتسوية
among
السلمية
countries
للنزاعات
based on peaceful
والاحترام
coexistence and peaceful
المتبادل
settlement of conflicts and
للالتزامات
the
الدولية
mutual respect of
والضمانات الأمنية
international commitments
لا
and
يمكن
security
لبلاد
guarantees.
الجزائر
My country,
إلا
Algeria,
الانضمام
can
إلى
only
كافة
join
الجهود
all the
والدعوات
other efforts
الدبلوماسية
and diplomatic
الهادفة إلى
calls
تخفيف
aiming
حدة
at
التوترات الحالية
de-escalating the current
وانتهاج
situation
فضائل الحوار
and
من أجل
adopting dialogue
إذكاء العيش
in
معا
order
في
to
سلام بين
foster
الدول
peaceful coexistence
حفاظا
among
على السلم
nations
والأمن
to safeguard
الدوليين.
international
Thank you,
peace
Mr.
and
President.
security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Algeria, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of United Republic of Tanzania.
Mr. President, the United Republic of Tanzania has decided to abstain this resolution as a matter of principle and in defense of the UN Charter. Fundamentally, this decision resulted from our inability to amend or make reservations to some provisions in the resolution. We were convinced that there was a need to adjust the draft resolution. The United Republic of Tanzania believes that diplomacy is the best way to end this conflict. To this end, we appeal to all parties to the dispute to uphold human rights and their obligations under international law and humanitarian law to de-escalate the conflict and give peace a chance. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Republic of Tanzania, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President, and we thank you for giving us the opportunity to take the floor to elaborate on South Africa's decision to abstain on today's resolution. Mr. President, let me reiterate our position expressed during the discussions of the emergency special session over the last few days. Firstly, by highlighting that South Africa remains deeply concerned by the escalation of conflict in Ukraine and the regional and international socio-economic implications. We strongly urge all sides to uphold international law, including humanitarian law and human rights law, as well as the principles of the UN Charter, including sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mr. President, the conflict involves two members of the United Nations in an armed conflict, which this organization has at its foundation the responsibility to prevent. The United Nations, therefore, must take decisions and actions that will lead to a constructive outcome conducive to the creation of sustainable peace between the parties. The resolution that we have considered today does not create an environment conducive for diplomacy, dialogue, and mediation. While we agree with and support the efforts taken by member states to bring to the attention of the international community the situation in Ukraine, South Africa feels that greater attention should have been paid to bringing the sides closer to dialogue. For South Africa, the text in its current form could drive a deeper wedge between the parties rather than contribute